Abdullahi Ahmad Naim, YB Syaril K. Johari, Executive Director of Penang Institute and Member of Parliament for Bukit Mertajam, Dr. Wong Chin Huat, Section Head for the Political and Social Analysis Department, Dr. Mustafa, Section Head for the Nusantara Studies, Ms. Ong Sia Woon, Senior Executive Officer of Penang Institute, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you very much for coming here tonight and waiting for a slightly substantial amount of time for this lecture or this talk today. So the topic for today is Toward an Islamic Society, Not an Islamic State, will be delivered by our distinguished guest here tonight. So before we begin, let's start with a brief introduction of our speaker. Before that, maybe we should invite YB Syaril K. Johari to give a brief opening remark.
Thanks, Kohin. I'm not the MP for Bukit Mertajam, by the way. I'm far better looking. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Our distinguished speaker today, Professor Abdullahi Ahmad Naim, all members of Penang Institute, fellows, Dr. Wong Chin Huat, see my PhD supervisors here, Professor Fauzi, and of course, ladies and gentlemen. It's with great pleasure that I welcome all of you here today for another Penang Institute talk, this time titled Towards an Islamic State, Towards an Islamic Society, Not an Islamic State. I think very much interesting topic for us to discuss here today, especially when we look at what's happening today and we see that once again our nation is beguiled by the specter of hudud, the term of course that is loosely used to reference the Sharia criminal code. And of course hudud in Malaysia is like an apparition that would emerge every once in a while, and it has supernatural powers because it would possess people who would normally be calm and reasonable and usually overcome them with emotion. Also, it is so bewitching that often we see erstwhile friends become enemies and long-time enemies, sworn enemies, become friends. That is the power of hudud. But of course, doctrinally, hudud refers to a set of punishments that are said to be divinely mandated for acts that breach the limits, or had. In fact, that's where the word hudud comes from, is the plural of the word had, which means limits. It's like the Malay word. And these limits which are set by God. And these crimes include theft, robbery, as well as acts within the realm of personal liberty, such as adultery, fornication, intoxication, apostasy, although there are different opinions on apostasy, on whether it applies, whether hudud applies. But the infamy of hudud, as it were, derives less from its crimes than actually its prescribed punishments, which list among them public lashing, stoning, crucifixion, and the amputation of limbs. But of course, we all know hudud is not a new issue. The attempts to implement the Sharia criminal code began in the early 1990s here in Malaysia, when the past-controlled state government of Kelantan passed the Sharia Criminal Code 2 enactment in 1993, and later 2003 when during PAS's short-lived stint as the government of Terengganu, they also passed the Sharia criminal law hudud and qisas enactment there. However, I think all this while, all these legislative efforts actually never amounted to much, because the general wisdom or general consensus was that there were limitations vis-a-vis federal law and the federal constitution. Hence, also because the federal government all this while has been against the implementation and opposed to it, therefore the possibility of it actually becoming reality was remote. Until now, in an astounding act of collusion recently, a government minister moved a motion in Parliament to fast-track a private member's bill by past President Datuk Sri Abdul Hadi Awang, which we all know. Actually, the bill has been sitting on the order paper since last year. It's the third parliamentary meeting in a row which it was tabled, but always last on the Parliament order paper. But this time, actually it was just 2 Thursdays ago, Datuk Sri Azalina, a cabinet minister, moved a motion to fast-track or prioritize the bill, essentially giving it priority over government business, which is unprecedented, has never been done before. And as a result, Hadi was allowed to move a motion to table this bill, which is actually a bill to amend the Sharia Court Act 1965, the Sharia Court Criminal Jurisdiction Act 1965, Act 355. And if passed, essentially what the amendments would do would be to lift the existing limits of punishments imposable by the Sharia courts, namely the 356 formula, which is 3 years jail, 5,000 ringgit fine, and 6 lashes maximum. But this time around, Datuk Sri Hadi's bill was slightly different from the ones that he had tabled actually last year, because this time it's been amended to exclude crimes listed under federal jurisdiction, such as theft, robbery, and sodomy, because it's covered by the penal code. So this actually cleverly circumvents the issue of explicit constitutionality. So with this is why they're going around trying to say this is not hudud or this is not extra-constitutional, because it leaves out the crimes which are already covered under the federal list in the 9th schedule of the federal constitution. Therefore, it would not allow the complete or full implementation of the 2 enactments, Kelantan and Terengganu. However, that said, it would actually enable most of the punishments prescribed for fornication, sexual slander, intoxication, and heresy. Although for the last one, heresy, it would be without the death penalty option. But most of the other punishments prescribed in the enactments, or at least definitely for the Kelantan enactment, would be enabled with this passing of this act, the amendment in Parliament. So, I think what we have seen, of course, is a very predictable outpouring of shock and outrage, not only from the traditional detractors of hudud, but also from within the ruling federal government coalition. But unfortunately, the lack of sophistication and holistic appreciation, I think, on this matter has created, and if you look at polemics today that have emerged, it's all laced with confusion, emotion, and division. It's not unexpected, of course, given the fact that the debate on hudud in Malaysia has predominantly been more political than religious. And if one were to observe, for example, you would find that there's hardly any conversation on the religious aspects of hudud. For example, the contested legitimacy of its non-primary references within Islam, the variety of conflicting opinions among Islamic scholars, the technical details of its codification into local legislation, although there's a very good book by Hashim Kamali, and even more critically, the philosophical question of its application given the conditions of the world today. So in Malaysia, the discourse on hudud, there's none of that. What you have instead is basically discussions about its constitutionality, its suitability in a multicultural milieu, its exploitation for narrow and short-term political gains, and often it is also used, and I think this is critical here in Malaysia, it is also used as a barometer for the larger question on the nature of the Malaysian state, whether it's a secular state or an Islamic one. And I think, to me, that is where the grand divide is between the advocates of a secular polity and an Islamic one. But and perhaps here I would like to advance a thought. Instead of attempting to find more lines of division, can we ask ourselves instead, can a secular state be Islamic? And conversely, can an Islamic state be secular? So it's an interesting question. And really there's no real conclusive approach right now to define indicators for how Islamic a society is. Although I think we can generally say that we accept that values such as justice, freedom, equality, efforts to alleviate poverty, reduce economic inequality, to promote social justice, these are all congruent and very much in line with the precepts of Islam. While vices such as corruption, opulence, also if you look at bad governance, suppression of human rights, all these are in conflict with the principles of Islam. I think that on that there's general agreement. And so what this professor at Georgetown, Washington University did a few years back, Hussein Askari, he aggregated these values and practices based on Quranic teachings on the economy, on human rights, on politics, freedom, law, political freedom, law, governance, international relations, and so on, to develop what he called an Islamicity index, and in which they used to measure 208 countries' performances. And so based on this Islamicity index, it was found that actually not a single Islamic or Muslim majority country managed to rank in the top 10. In fact, the countries whose economic achievements and social values most reflected Islamic traits turned out to be New Zealand, Luxembourg, Ireland, Iceland, Finland, Denmark, Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, and the Netherlands, all of which are secular, non-Muslim majority countries. In fact, the only two Muslim majority countries in the top 50 are Malaysia at 38 and Kuwait at 48. So of course, I'm not here to say that this is an authoritative way of measuring Islamicity, but I think this index gives us a general idea of the state of most so-called Islamic societies in the world. And as we can see, most of them eschew the very tenets of Islam in the governance of their states and their societies. So more significantly, the results also show actually that most Islamic countries in the world turn out to be secular ones, while secular countries can indeed exhibit Islamic characteristics. So this is where here, I think we are reminded very much of Muhammad Abduh's famous expression, I went to the West and saw Islam but no Muslims, came back to the East and saw Muslims but no Islam. So we ask ourselves at this point, I think, can such a concept actually exist? A state that is both secular and Islamic? I suppose it's something that's easy to say in theory, but the interesting thing is, I think right now, that we are sort of seeing the genesis or the formation, or at least the effort towards creating one in Tunisia. It's an example that I've used in my writings a lot. And if you look at Tunisia, following the Arab Spring after end of 2010, December, of course, Tunisia, just like all the other countries that went through the Arab Spring, I think they faced pretty much the same challenges. But I think it is interesting how Tunisia has managed to navigate out of the same problems that essentially countries like Egypt, Libya, and others could not get out of. They took a different turn. They chose instead a path of dialogue, inclusiveness, and the will to facilitate what they now term as a civil state with an Islamic identity. So they've, essentially, Tunisia, after the fall of dictator, just like all the other countries, saw the rise of Islamic movements, Islamist movements, and of course the Muslim Brotherhood sister party organization, or whatever you want to call it, in Tunisia at the time is called, or was called, still called the Ennahda movement. So the Ennahda movement coalesced as a political party, and they actually won the majority of the seats in the first election ever held after Ben Ali's toppling. And although they won, there was a compromise later. Of course, there were other dynamics and factors as well. Tunisia, as we all know, has a history, a very strong secular elite. But compromises were made. The whole country did not go into chaos. Instead, there was a dialogue, which later actually ended up winning the Nobel Prize last year. The dialogue among the 4 NGOs, civil society organizations there, but facilitated very much by the Islamist movement Ennahda and its leader Rashid Ghannouchi. And in fact, most recently, I think it was just last week, Ghannouchi in a political rally to all his members, actually announced that Tunisia would depart from political Islam and move into what he termed Muslim democracy. And so I quote here, he says, Ennahda has changed from an ideological movement engaged in a struggle for identity to a protest movement against the authoritarian regime, and now to a national democratic party. And in fact, he said, we must keep religion far from political struggles. So it's very interesting now what is happening. We are seeing what could be the nascent democratic Islamic State, which manages to separate religion from the state. Now, of course, it's still a work in progress, very much a work in progress, and we shall see in the future how things eventually pan out. But I just want to say that it is something for us to think about, to learn about. So certainly it's not my role here to tell us how things are going to happen and what the best solution is, because it's not as simple as that. But tonight we will hear from a distinguished scholar who will give us definitely, no doubt, more ideas on trying to understand these forces that we are grappling with in our society today. So I think Kok Hin, you will do an introduction of the speaker, so I will not need to. I would just like to say thank you very much to everyone for attending, and we look forward to a great discussion ahead. So thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, YB Syariah, Member of Parliament from Bukit Bendera. Thank you, Dr. Afif, Penang Exco, for joining us today. So now, we'll move to the next session of this evening. So before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Abdullahi Ahmad An-Naim is the Charles Howard Chandler Professor of Law at Emory Law, Associate Professor in the Emory College of Arts and Sciences, and Senior Fellow of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion of Emory University. An internationally recognized scholar of Islam, human rights, and human rights in cross-cultural perspective, Professor An-Naim teaches courses in international law, comparative law, human rights, and Islamic law. His books include What is an American Muslim, published by the Oxford University Press, Muslims and Global Justice, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, and Islam and the Secular State, Negotiating the Future of Sharia, published by Harvard University Press. I've actually seen the Indonesian translation of the last book, Negotiating the Future of Sharia, quite popular in Indonesia. So without further ado, let's invite Professor Abdullahi Ahmad An-Naim for a brief lecture.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Good evening. I noticed that in the introduction it was said to present a brief lecture. So I take it that my time is limited, and therefore I should try to make the most use of it as soon as I can get to the point. And I wish actually that we are at a point where we can afford the luxury of learning from this country and looking at that country in that reflective manner. If you would allow me to be very candid and blunt, this country is facing a really serious challenge. And I don't believe that you have time to really reflect or to sit back and think about this and the other. I think that I am from Sudan. I lived all my life until I was 40 years old in Sudan. I have lived now in the United States for the last 23 or 24 years. So I speak, and throughout my life I've also struggled with these issues personally and professionally. And I have watched these scenarios happen and come and to engulf countries and societies. I remember in the early 2000s, precisely around 2004, I was part of a conference in Nigeria that was convened in a university called Jos, which is one of the central states in the country. And the conference was about the implementation of Sharia or the enforcement of Sharia in northern Nigeria. And at that conference, I said that you will not be able to enforce Sharia. What you will succeed in doing is push your country into a civil war. And I'm sorry to say that both predictions turned out to be true. I wish I was wrong, but I don't think that I was, given what actually happened. That the application of enforcement of Sharia in northern Nigeria has failed. And you can look in and see how miserably and how drastically that failure is. But the problem is that it is not just simply a failure of some project or elite sort of adventure, but it will reflect very severely and negatively on Islam and Sharia itself. Because when the corruption and when the mismanagement and when the violence continues to engulf the whole country, and yet it's supposed to be Sharia governed, then it will reflect on Sharia. But the second part is also true. Now Nigeria is in a state of civil war. With Boko Haram engaging in sort of blowing up suicide bombings and kidnapping of schoolgirls and all sorts of atrocities being committed throughout northern Nigeria and into neighboring countries. But the point is that I'm just cautioning that please take this matter very seriously. I don't think that you have much time, honestly. And that if you really don't stand up and challenge this quickly, it will reach soon the point of no return. And the point about the point of no return is that once Sharia enacted, it cannot be unenacted. If politicians are not really principled enough and strong enough to say no to the so-called enactment of Sharia to begin with, they will not, necessarily, they will not be strong enough and wise enough to say no to and to sort of repeal statutes that are enacted in the name of Sharia. Now, since I have very little time, let me move on to the title actually of this conversation. I will speak briefly, as I said, and then we'll have a conversation with Mustafa about, and with all of us here in this room. I have this tendency to try to question the title of every presentation, because that's a good way to start opening up the issues. And although this title I probably suggested to the Penang Institute, or at least we agreed that this should be the title, but I would like to begin by questioning the term, for example, Islamic, in the title, and of course the notion of the state and society. So all elements can be questioned. But let me begin by the term Islamic. The problem with Islamic is that there is no standard accepted criteria of what is Islamic, and there is no institutional, neutral or independent way by which it can be applied, and no way by which it can be verified. So when someone cares, I'm Islamic this, Islamic that, whatever the claim is, that we don't have like a series of boxes that we can tick. You are Islamic 3 out of 5, you are Islamic 7 out of 10. There is no agreed criteria of what is Islamic. And in this country, actually, recently I learned that there's something called the Sharia Index, which is an absurd notion. And really it is indicative of really the fundamental confusion, because the question is that Sharia is a personal code of conduct. It is a normative system which each and every individual Muslim have to decide and to abide by for themselves, by themselves. It is not possible to establish, and it's not possible to verify people's compliance with Sharia, because ultimately it's a matter of intent, of a niyyah. If you don't have the intent to comply, then the appearance of compliance has no meaning. Talking about Islam itself as a religion, as a faith, it has to be a matter of choice. By that I mean that if I do not have the freedom not to believe, I cannot believe either. That is, belief has to be a choice. It cannot be something that the only option is to believe, then that is not belief. It has no religious significance, it has no personal sort of behavioral or value system, sort of attribute to it. So the ambiguity of the term Islamic at least alert us to the complexity of the notion of what we are talking about here. When we say Islamic society, again, are we talking about, there is 1.8 billion Muslims around the world. That is, really, if you think about it, it is a quarter of humanity. That is, 1 in every 4 people is a Muslim. If you take Islam to be self-identifying as such, but if you talk about someone's defining what is Islam a Muslim and deciding who is a Muslim and who is not a Muslim, then you will have problems for a lot of people around the world, including many of the people in this room probably. In fact, whoever you are, you stand to be un-Islamic by someone's criteria of what is Islamic. You may be aware of this, or you can look it up. It's quite available actually online. There is something called the Munir Commission report. The Munir Commission was a commission that was established at the beginning of the independence of Pakistan to define who is a Muslim. Munir, M-U-N-I-R. And that commission, after interviewing hundreds of ulama and scholars and state officials and judges, concluded that it is not possible to define who is a Muslim. And that every group of Muslims in Pakistan are in fact deemed to be non-Muslim by some other group. That there is no agreement among Pakistanis, and of course this is still true. For the Shia Pakistanis, at least just to be obvious, the Sunni Pakistanis are not Muslims and vice versa. So it is really a futile exercise to try to define who is a Muslim. And think for yourself what it is that defines a Muslim, by whose understanding and by what criteria. But the point, at least, it is to emphasize that whatever the qualities that each one of us, what I would like to suggest is that we should keep these options or these characteristics and qualities up to our individual and our reflective consensus and debate and contestation. That is, we should not entrust the enforcement of the qualities of being a Muslim to some institution or some entity. Because that entity or institution is likely to be hijacked for some political reasons and objectives, and then it will be beyond our control to even protect our identity as Muslims. Because we will be deemed to be deviant, we will be deemed to be sort of un-Islamic or heretics or murtad or kafir and so on. So at least the point for the first part of the title is to keep the question open and to keep it societal. That is in the realm of society, because that's where people can contest and debate without coercion, without fear of state coercive action. So I'll just keep it at that. By that I mean that whatever we deem to be the qualities of being a Muslim, and it's actually fascinating what we heard from Zahir Jawhari about how the index of Islamicity turned out to be quite unfavorable to so-called Muslim majority countries, unfavorable to others. And you, of course, at the point of that exercise, as he said, is not really to be definitive and authoritative, but to be actually reflective and sobering thought. That if you are talking about values, if you are talking about practices of honesty, of hard work, of charity, of compassion and concern, that we don't have a monopoly on all of that. In fact, we may not have a passing grade in any of that, as that particular study seemed to suggest. But the point is still is that it is something that we can talk about and something that we can contest and challenge and redefine, and that is the way I think it should be. But when I come to the second part about Islamic State, I would like to suggest that there is no such thing as an Islamic State. It was never a single day of an Islamic state. By any definition of the state and any definition of Islamic that you care to have. And I will be happy to elaborate on that further. But the point is that I think also Khair Jawhari's, one of his remarks was to ask the question, can an Islamic state be secular and can a secular state be Islamic? Obviously, you are not using the term state and stem in the two parts of this formula in the same sense. Because, and that is actually the problematic of this conversation, that is what we mean by state. And as I started already, what we mean by Islamic. But what we mean by state is probably what we need to be very clear about these days in relation to Malaysia or other countries as well. The notion of a state, obviously, in terms of some sort of political structure of self-governance, is ancient and is vastly varied. I mean, there is such a wide variety of states, historically speaking. And that Muslims, from the very beginning, have always had states. True. That if you think of the Medina state of Abu Bakr, Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Umar, Ali, and Uthman, that was a state. If you think of the Umayyad dynasty, that was a state. Of the Abbasi dynasty, that was a state. All the way to the Ottoman Empire, and that was a state. But none of them was an Islamic state. And this is why I emphasize the definition of what is Islamic. Because none of them is Islamic for all Muslims to accept as such. The day the Prophet ﷺ died, and before he was buried, Muslims disagreed politically about his succession. Who is to succeed the Prophet? And there were different camps. I mean, you may be familiar with the narrative of the meeting in Saqifat ibn Sa'ida and how people who were in that meeting disagreed as to who should succeed the Prophet, and that ultimately it came to a contest between Ali and Ali ibn Abi Talib and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and Abu Bakr won by virtue of Umar ibn Khattab confirming him and paying allegiance, saying Ubayyu'uka, that is, I pay allegiance to you. And others followed. But Ali ibn Abi Talib himself did not pay allegiance to Abu Bakr. And that is significant. And as we know, that is a divide between Sunnah and Muslim and Shia from that time. And then you go on to see how the affairs of the Medina state itself were conducted, and how divisive it was among the leading companions, how Ali and Aisha were in a military conflict in which major Sahaba, 2 of the 10 who are Al-Ashar al-Mubashiruna bil-Jannah, were killed in Waqi'at al-Jamal, which was between Ali's army and Aisha's army. That Uthman ibn Affan, the 3rd caliph, was assassinated, killed actually, by the young men who were children of Sahaba in his own home in Medina at a time when other major companions were in Medina who did not rise to defend Uthman. This is actually recorded and very well-known history. And then you come and see also how actually 3 out of the 4 caliphs of Medina were assassinated. And then the civil war between Ali and Muawiyah, between Ali and Al-Khawarij, and throughout Muslim history, you see all of that happening. So the point, therefore, is that there was never a consensus about what it is, what is an Islamic state, as there was no acceptance among Muslims universally or even significantly regionally about that. But the point I'm making is simply to say that those states did not have a quality that is identifiable and verifiable among Muslims. And here is another difficulty with the notion of an Islamic state. Who is going to maintain the integrity and the authenticity of that state according to its own claim? So if you accept that state X qualifies as an Islamic state, hypothetically, just for the sake of argument, say Iran, say Pakistan, whoever you choose to nominate. But then what happens if it ceases to be an Islamic state? Because when we are supposed to be social scientists and we work with sort of academic concepts and ideas. So if someone should qualify as something, or an entity should qualify as something, it should be possible for it to unqualify. Otherwise, its qualifying will be meaningless. So if a state, assuming that, for the sake of argument, the state is today qualifies as an Islamic state, because it maintains law and order, it protects the weak, it promotes compassion, whatever criteria and features that you choose to, including because it orders restaurants to close for Ramadan, and because it forces people into mosques to pray. All of these qualities have been known to around the world to be qualities that so-called Islamic states seek to promote. So assuming that those type of criteria, nonsensical as they may seem, to be true about some states somewhere, what if it ceases to do that? So how would you take it back? So when you give a state the legitimizing title of being Islamic, how can you take it back when it ceases to be Islamic? And if you can't take it back, what is the value in giving it that title in the first place? So these are some of the confusions about this idea of an Islamic state and how it is, so what passes these days as an Islamic state in our conversations. But about an Islamic society, I think that is more meaningful, because it is not a pass or fail. It is not a classification or a standard that we can apply or disapply. It's just simply about how Islamic values are infused in social practice. How, and it is open to improvement constantly, because there is no question about a rush to qualify and then a failure to qualify and so on. But it's simply about sort of how Islamic values are promoted in people's behavior. And at that society level, I would like to suggest that the standards of behavior are normative, not legal, meaning that every normative system, every society needs both legal as well as normative, more broadly normative ideas. So that is how we socialize our children, how we conduct our interpersonal relationships, how we engage in types of practices of everyday life is not always, in fact, for the most situations, they are not legal. That's what I would like to refer to as normative, meaning that they are values that, to be truthful. To lie is not illegal, but it is un-Islamic. It cannot be, it is not a crime to lie, but it is a sin to lie. Which immediately raises the question that a sin is not necessarily a crime, and a crime is not necessarily a sin. You can have conduct which is a sin and does not qualify as a crime, or vice versa. There is a particular process by which crimes are defined, by which crimes are enforced, and that is to do with the realm of the state legal system, which is a secular legal system. It is never a religious legal system, because there is no agreement among believers as to what is, and unbelievers too, about what is and what is not a crime and a sin. That is, in other words, that we should not confuse these two ideas, and it is important to keep this distinction. So therefore, the qualities of being Muslim is something that we can cultivate, and it is something that we can keep promoting within ourselves and in our communities. And that is what makes the possibility of an Islamic state. And the question therefore would be, what do we need to do as a society, as a community, to promote these values in our so-called Islamic society? But Going now on the side of the state a little bit and being very specific about this country or any Sudan where I come from or any other country that you choose, that the problem with the nature of the state in the post-colonial era is that it is necessarily a nation state. That we may have had the choice, of course, I mean, what our imaginary and memory of our pre-colonial past is something that is very contested and often quite mythologized. But whatever our pre-colonial type of political administration and social ordering and so on were is not something that we can redeem and reenact. Because we have been constituted as nation states, which are territorially bound, which are centralized, hierarchical, and bureaucratic, and coercive. All these qualities are qualities of the nation states. It has to be. Centralized, territorial. It has to have political boundaries. Actually, if you look into any text that discusses, and there are treaties which discuss what is a state, you find that it will have the 4 characteristics. It has to have definite territory, it has to have permanent population, it has to have a viable government that's capable of conducting international relations, and it has to be recognized by other states as such. That's why ISIS has not yet qualified as a state. It may, one would wonder, that the Taliban government in Afghanistan was not, but that a state can be, once recognized, can remain a state even if it lacks a government, like Somalia. Somalia has remained a state, although it has not had a government for since 1992. And so Palestine, to us, it is a state sociologically and politically, but it is not a state that is recognized by other states and so on. So the point I'm making here is that the characteristic of a nation state are fixed by international law, are required by international relations, and in fact are imperative as a matter of necessities of trade and diplomatic relations and security relations and so on. Malaysia happened to be one of those states. And as such, it is a state of all its citizens. It is not the state of Muslims of Malaysia. And it is not really up to the Muslims of Malaysia to decide what rights non-Muslims should have by virtue of the religion. As soon as you get into that, you are losing the very quality of being a state. You will no longer be acknowledged by the international community as a state. You will be in violation of the Charter of the United Nations, of which this country and every other country in the world today is a member. So the quality of a state as a nation state is not something that is negotiable. It is not something that we can change at will. It is something that we have to maintain and protect, and that the rest of the world will not leave us alone to do as we please with that. Because there are implications for other nations, including neighboring nations, including what we see now about Syria and the flight of refugees and the implications for other countries. So therefore, the question is, it is not up to Malaysia to enact a bill that will in fact relegate some of its citizens to the status of second-class citizens. And by the way, if I may briefly elaborate on the remarks that Zairo Khair Jawhari said about the bill, the more crucial part of the bill is Article 2A. And I just happened to look at that very closely because it was part of a conference that, a news conference that I attended and was participated in yesterday morning in Kuala Lumpur. And that, I think, Article 2A, or section, is extremely significant because it authorizes Sharia courts to impose any punishment authorized by Islamic law, except the death penalty. So what I see going on here, of course, I'm not as privy to the precise history and formulation of the relevant legislation and constitutional provisions, but what I see here is a camouflage, an attempt to cover up and to sneak some sort of features and qualities that once implanted cannot be unplanted, it cannot be taken back. And which is precisely the question of the jurisdiction of Sharia courts to enforce hudud punishments. But let me also go on, because I would like to get into the conversation that with Mustafa, and so that we can all participate. There is something also that is very disturbing about what is the whole exercise about past and about the Islamist discourse about hudud and so on. This license that sort of Malaysian politicians seem to have with Sharia. I mean, the fact that you choose to hold back and advance aspects of it as you choose fit, without any regard for the coherence and methodological integrity of what we call historically Sharia. That Sharia is not an arbitrary sort of game that you can enter and leave as you please. It has its rules. You may disagree with those rules. You may argue for their reformulation, as I personally do. You may advocate a revision of usul al-fiqh, as I personally call for. But it is not simply up to me to say whether or not these changes have been made and accepted by Muslims. As of today, I'm hereby deciding that it is no longer possible to impose this punishment, which is a had punishment. So if you are talking about hudud, the death penalty is a had punishment, meaning that there are certain crimes, hudud crimes, that Muslims generally accept, for which this is the had punishment. If you are talking about hudud as a matter of sort of Islamic integrity, you cannot just simply hold back this punishment as discretionary, and eventually when you have more conditions conducive to this, once you have enforced other things, you can create a political environment in which you can reintroduce the death penalty. So it is not really up to people to decide what is and what is not. If you are talking about hudud, then there is a set of punishments that must be prescribed and must be enforced according to Muslim jurisprudence. And you cannot really, as I said, just simply exercise your personal discretion or your political expediency to hold back this and that. Now, let us again be specific about the term hudud, because again, Khair Jawhari also mentioned that they are the boundaries and this and that. Actually, the term hudud is not Quranic, and it is not in the Sunnah. The Quran mentions hudud Allah twice. In both instances, they refer to the rights of women in personal family relations, and what men may, husbands that is, may or may not deny women's rights. But there is no connection or reference in the Quran connecting any of the punishments or the crimes and the punishments that the Quran prescribes to the term hudud. There is no mention in Sunnah to this connection. It is a juridical innovation. That is, jurists subsequently term these punishments hudud. Now let me take another angle at this too, so that you can see that we are not talking about as categorical and as definitive crimes that we tend to assume. None of the crimes that we call hudud is defined in the Quran itself. Not even sariqah. The term sariqah is used, but it is not defined. The term zina is used, but it is not defined. The term khasf is used, but it is not defined. The term haraba, or qat'u tariq, as sometimes people call it, or the other, are mentioned but are not defined. So, as a matter of common practice and centralized administration of justice, you need to have your crimes defined so that you can enforce those crimes. Now, all of those terms came to be defined by jurists subsequently, but they are not defined in the Quran itself. And go and look and see if the Quran defines any of them. when the jurists came to define, they defined according to the practices of their communities at the time. So for example, sariqa was defined as taking of the minimum, which is a nisab, from a hirz, which is a secure place, khilsa, which is in stealth, without legal justification or shubha. So, but those requirements have been also elaborated to come to very different conclusions, actually, that we will find today very disturbing. That the notion of shubha is used to argue that, not only to argue, but in fact to rule, that stealing public property is not sariqa haddiyah, that it cannot be punished by amputation of the right hand. So if you steal the nisab, which is a minimum amount, from a hirz, from a private person's hirz, that is secure place, one is liable to amputation of the right hand. But if you steal millions of dollars from the public treasury, you are not subject to uqubat al-had, to the punishment of had. Now, check this out for yourself and see. If that is the case, how would that appeal to our sense of justice and fairness today? To say that our elites, who may manipulate and may abuse our trust and steal our public funds, can get away with that, whereas the people who are the most marginalized, the poorest, will have their hands amputated. I'm sorry, unfortunately, that time is short, but I'm happy to revisit any of these issues. So the point, therefore, I'm saying that the nature of Sharia does not lend itself to codification. And again, to be categorical, there has never been codification of Sharia from the beginning until the 20th century. There was an effort by the Ottomans in the mid-19th century to codify part of the Hanafi school, what is known as al-Majalla, relating to property and transactions. But the totality of the Hanafi school was not codified by the Ottoman. Neither has any of the other schools been codified by any state throughout Muslim history until the 20th century. In the 20th century, you have these ideas about an Islamic State for the first time emerging in Muslim discourse. The term Islamic State is again not to be found in Muslim history. In fact, the term state is not to be found in the Quran at all, not a single time. So where does this come from? I mean, this notion that there's something called an Islamic State that the Quran sanctions. If the Quran does not even mention the term state, it does not prescribe any characteristic or qualities of what the state should be. So these ideas came out actually in the discourse of the 1930s and onwards in relation to Pakistan. To begin with, for example, Abu Al al-Mawdudi, Muhammad Asad in particular, actually he's the one who coined the term Islamic State for the first time in Muslim discourse. Muhammad Asad, who is a Jewish convert to Islam, he's, by the way, the father of Talal Asad, who converted to Islam in his 20s and came and lived, he was an advisor to King Abdul Aziz, the founder of the modern Saudi state, and then he left him at 5 years and went into India and became part of the movement for Pakistan. He is the one who coined the term Islamic State. And he is the one who prescribed the idea that the state can enforce codification of Sharia. Those ideas are not in our discourse before the 20th century. And when it came to be, it was adopting a European idea of the state and a European idea of positive law. Both ideas are not part of our tradition. The idea of a centralized, hierarchical nation-state in this nature is not in our tradition, and the idea of codification of Sharia. The reason why Sharia cannot be codified is because of the varieties of opinion to which all Muslims are equally entitled to choose from. That you cannot require, you are Shafi'is, for example, by and large in this country. Okay? So imagine as a Shafi'i being required to live under a Maliki doctrine. It will be fundamentally offensive to your sense of who you are as a Muslim. If you are a Hanbali, you would not live or accept to live under Hanafi school position. So, for example, if you look at today at Saudi Arabia and Iran, in Saudi Arabia, Shia Saudis, citizens of the country, are required to live according to the Wahhabi doctrine, to whom it is a heresy. So what does it mean for them to be Muslims by conviction and choice, according to their own belief, when they are required to live to a doctrine, under a doctrine which they reject? And the same is true about the Sunnis of Iran. You know, the Sunnis of Iran are constitutionally defined as a religious minority. So these are realities that we have to acknowledge and to see the contradiction in them. Therefore, the idea of an Islamic State, I said, because the idea of codification, not only that it will force people to choose among competing ideas, but also that the language of the statute becomes the law. And it is law because of the will of the state, not because of the fact that it is part of Sharia. That is, now this Sharia bill that is being talked about today, the Hudud bill, so-called, now this will be law or not law, not because it is Sharia, but because the state of Malaysia said so. You know, so it is the fact that will the parliament vote for or against this bill will mean the difference between will Sharia or no Sharia be enforced in this country. And of course you can see that obviously is a contradiction. How can, if Sharia is of the integrity and of the compelling authority that we claim it has, how can it be contingent on the will of the state and the political and parliamentary maneuvers of political parties in parliament? I must come to a close, I think, so that we can have the conversation that I keep referring to. My conclusion is simply to say that we can all, everywhere, continue to advance to an Islamic society according to our own beliefs and convictions. And that we can, in that process, reinterpret Sharia and recontest some of the values that Sharia sort of enforces or enhances, because Sharia, as we know it today, is a product of human interpretation. And that, in the realm of society, I think is feasible and it is legitimate to do. What the state needs to do is to protect the space for people to negotiate and to contest what Sharia means to them and to live according to their own convictions. That is, the freedom of a Muslim to be a Muslim by conviction and choice is what the state is supposed to be charged with. That possibility will be under a secular state, I would argue, but don't call it secular if you don't like the term, call it X. What we mean is a state that is neutral regarding religious doctrine. Whether you don't like the term secular, Muslims seem to find it offensive or has associations with colonialism, although the vast majority of Muslim majority countries are in fact secular states. Some of them are constitutionally secular, acknowledged as such, and I think way before Tunisia, I think we should acknowledge and respect the experience of Senegal, which is constitutionally defined as a secular state, while 96% of the population of Senegal are Muslims, and very pious Muslims and highly respected as Muslims throughout West Africa and other regions of Africa. So the point, therefore, is that the nature of the state that we live with, we could change it, we could abandon it, we could start with a new project of the state as a ummah of the whole Muslim world. But until we do that, we have to respect and accept the nature of the state as we have it today, which is a territorial nation state. And as such, all citizens of the country are entitled to equal rights and treatment by that state, and it is not up to the state to take away that right from them. What we attempted to do in Sudan is what resulted in the breakaway of South Sudan. And what I worry about Nigeria is that it might also lead to a breakaway of parts of northern Nigeria. Would you want to entertain that possibility in relation to Malaysia? How would you talk to your Chinese neighbor or your Hindu neighbor about their fundamental rights when they're denied that? Because, you know, the Hudud bill is not simply that matter of what punishment the state can enforce, but hudud, we have to acknowledge the structural qualities of hudud, including the fact that non-Muslims cannot be accepted as a competent witness in a had crime. A woman who is raped cannot testify, cannot charge her rapist with rape, because that will be qasf, unless she can prove it as rape, and she cannot prove it as rape because even her own testimony is not accepted in hudud language. I mean, are you aware of these features of hudud, so that we can talk about it in that sort of really disturbing manner that I noticed? But I hope that I have not offended too many people, but let's see what you have to say about what I said. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Anaim. Yeah, Dr. Mus and Professor, maybe seated over here. I think there's a lot that the Professor said over there. If uttered by a Malaysian, we will probably be visited by, I don't know, special branch or Sedition Act very soon. So today's discussion will be moderated by Dr. Mus. Dr. Mus is the section head of the Nusantara Studies here at the Penang Institute, and he was formerly an academic in University Science Malaysia. So without further ado, I would like to pass it to Dr. Mus.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Corinne. I think we've heard Professor Naim unpacking several concepts which I feel probably would make you ready to go, not to go out of this room, but to ask questions or perhaps also to make observations. So without much ado, I would invite probably first set of 3 questions from the audience. No one?
Well, Professor, thank you so much. I have questions about Muslim attitude towards religious freedom. We commonly find that Muslims in the West would want to have religious freedom, but the reverse is not common. In many Muslim majority countries, religious freedom is often seen as open door to either atheism or a concession to the minority and so on. Why is this incongruent? Thank you.
Another question?
Hello, good evening, Professor. First, I just want to say that I really support this, I guess, this secularist discourse, because I think it's important. But however, I think we have to pay attention to some of the questions that will be answered to us whenever we put forth this argument. For example, you mentioned that there is no mentioning of an Islamic State in the Quran. And I can imagine when you say that, a counter argument would be, of course, there are no mentioning of nation state because there was no, the concept of nation state that did not exist back then. They probably will respond by saying something like, since Islam is supposed to be an everlasting ad-din, right? It's supposed to be suitable for all ages. So that means even though it is not, Islamic State is not mentioned in the Quran, by logical thinking, you can adapt it in the era of nation states and produce a concept called Islamic State. And I just want to ask, like, from our Turkish experiment, it seems like it's a really tricky thing to secularize an Islamic, Muslim majority country. So how should we deal with that? Thank you.
Assalamualaikum, Prof. I have a question regarding in Malaysia. I think Malaysia is one of the countries that has dual system, in the sense that we have a Sharia court and also a civil court. And I think one of the biggest debate up to the federal court level now is the issue of conversion and the custody of children between two different parents with different religion. And there's always the dispute of boundaries, whether these people could be called up to the Sharia court to be tried, or this should be discussed in the civil court. So do you, in your view, is there a possibility of, or is it sustainable to have this system to remain in the country? Or we should just have one court, either Sharia or civil, to be in Malaysia? That's all.
Yes. Okay. I think we have 3 questions to begin with here now. The first question about religious freedom. Of course, it's not true. I mean, by the way, the term West and rest is always problematic, because there is no coherent monolithic West. After all, Nazi Germany was part of the West. Nazi Germany was part of the West. The Soviet Union was part of the West. Fascist Portugal, fascist Spain. So my point is to say that there is no coherent monolithic West as a single sort of cultural, ideological entity. We can see very significant differences among Western societies, including the question of freedom of religion. That the United States, for example, presents a view of freedom of religion that is categorically premised on the notion of separation of religion and the state, to the extent that you cannot have the state established, because of the First Amendment prohibition of establishment of religion, you cannot have any shade or degree of public funding of religious education in the United States. So the notion of religious education is seen as a violation of the First Amendment of the American Constitution. In Germany, the state routinely funds religious education, meaning that the state pays salaries of teachers who teach religious studies in schools, in state schools. So if you are looking to see, you can see a very significant difference between Germany and the United States regarding questions of, you might say, freedom of religion, between these two countries and so on. There are other examples to mention, but the point I wanted to start with is to avoid speaking about the West as a single monolithic social entity and so on. Now, the question, I know that your question was about how is it that it is in the West it is this and in the Muslim world it is that.
Muslim attitude towards religious freedom. For example, conversion. Muslim would be rather happy to see the religious freedom for others to convert into Islam, right? But on the other hand, the reverse may not be true.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because
so it's more about that part.
Because Sharia is believed to punish the crime of ridda. So actually the reason is not that mysterious. Historically, throughout Muslim history, there was this notion of ridda and murtad, and the notion that ridda is punishable by death. which you can try to understand in historical context, even in fact geopolitical, historical, structural context of tribal allegiance and the need, because when someone converts away from Islam, you are losing a member of your community into the other community. Whereas if someone converts into Islam, you are gaining. So it could be seen in purely geopolitical power relations terms. But the understanding is that Sharia requires that those who are Muslims remain Muslim, and that children of a Muslim man will be deemed to be Muslim, and there are other consequences that go in terms of the inability of a Muslim woman to marry a non-Muslim man, whereas the Muslim man can marry a Christian or a Jew, appeal of the book. So, I mean, there is a cluster of norms of what we now call Sharia, which tend to, for example, the question of inheritance, that a non-Muslim cannot, difference of religion is a part to inheritance. Meaning a non-Muslim cannot inherit from a Muslim and vice versa. So these concepts and ideas have been historically present in Sharia, and we can also see them to be part of our socio-economic and political structures and institutions. That mindset has not changed still, and we continue to maintain the idea that there is something called apostasy, which is punishable by death, although the Quran does not require any punishment for apostasy. So we can dispute that notion, and until we change our consciousness and acceptance of the idea of apostasy, Muslims will remain opposed to the idea of conversion away from Islam. If you may want to note, of course, in the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when Saudi Arabia sort of abstained from supporting the Universal Declaration in 1948, it cited Article 18 in particular about freedom of religion, including the right to change one's religion, as the reason why it will abstain from the adoption of, from supporting the Universal Declaration. When other human rights treaties came to enact this article, Muslim states usually, or Muslim majority states, would enter reservations regarding this particular article. So it is a dominant theme in our discourse. The reason why is because we are insecure. Because we do not believe enough in Islam to trust that people remain Muslims by choice and conviction. So here is a religion where if you are born into it, you cannot leave it. And if you try to do, you will be killed for it. So is that the only way to remain Muslim? I mean, do we have to keep people Muslim by threatening them with death? But yet, that is the way you are doing it in many majority Muslim countries. And also, there is also the civil death of an apostate. We tend to forget it's not only about the death penalty. It's about civil death as well. Because a man, like what happened to Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd in Egypt, a Muslim who is believed to be a non-Muslim or converted away from Islam or became a murtad, his wife will be divorced from him. His children will no longer continue to be attributed to him because he's no longer a Muslim, and therefore the children will have to remain Muslim in some other way. So I think that the reason for it is because of this, the punishment, the social aversion, and fundamentally the sort of emotional, religious insecurity of Muslims that they need to keep people within the fold by threatening them with this. To the point about Islam, Salih kul zaman wa makan, I mean the notion that Islam is appropriate for all time and place. We say this without thinking really critical. I'm not saying that you don't, but the point is that Islam cannot remain Salih kul zaman wa makan if it is not open to change. Because, I mean, if places and times change, then whatever applies to them has to change accordingly, or else it cannot apply. Think about it. I mean, the idea that if the status of women remains the same, if the status of religious freedom and the question of apostasy remains the same. The question of jihad remains the same. Slavery remains the same. By the way, let us put it very bluntly here. Slavery is still lawful under Sharia. Slavery has not been abolished anywhere in relation to Sharia. It was abolished by colonial administrations in relation to secular administrations, but not in relation to Sharia. That's why now there are women who are being sold into slavery in Syria under ISIS administration. Now, please look into this yourself and examine it, and if I'm wrong, just simply declare it to whoever on your Facebook or Twitter and so on, that slavery is still part of Sharia. Can we say that Islam is good for all time and place, including slavery? Or are we saying that no understanding of Islam that includes slavery can be part of Islam for today, for example? So in other words, that the claim that Islam is appropriate for all time and place necessarily requires the possibility of changing our understanding of Islam, because it's all about our interpretation of Islam. It's not about Islam itself in the abstract. It's about human beings and what they understand Islam to mean and how they practice it. So, for example, today there are very few of us, hopefully an increasingly sort of diminishing number, who still maintain that women's status and rights should remain the same as provided for under Sharia. But that position remains true in Sharia. Unless you are willing to change that position in Sharia, you are bound to follow it in your social and legal practice. So if that is the case, then Islam in this respect, or rather it is Sharia or our understanding of Sharia in this respect, is not appropriate for today. Jihad, in the sense of aggressive, assertive, proactive use of force to promote the spread of Islam. Now, Muslims will tend to cite to you various verses that will try to argue that jihad is only appropriate as self-defense. Jihad is truly appropriate as self-defense, but it is also appropriate as a means of spreading the face of Islam. And it has been historically used to spread Islam by force militarily. You cannot say that Muslim armies went out of Arabia into Spain and North Africa all the way to Spain and all the way to northern India in self-defense. I mean, don't we remember and know that history? Don't we know that Muslim armies went into throughout Persia, into Central Asia, and throughout sort of, again, Afghanistan into northern India? Did those armies go all that way in self-defense? Or in the name of spreading Islam by military force and conquest? The hadith, I mean, there is a book by a Muslim scholar from Pakistan. His name is Muhammad Hamidullah. If you please make a note of it and look it up yourself. The book is called The Muslim Conduct of State. The Muslim Conduct of State by Muhammad Hamidullah, a Pakistani scholar. That book was first published in 1941, and has been published in more than 26 prints and translated into several languages. I know that all of that because I really worked with that book quite closely. The reason is, that book contains all the authorities, and by the way, Hamidullah himself believes that to be the case, that jihad is legitimate to spread the faith. And he, for example, narrates hadith of the Prophet about instructions that the Prophet gave to leaders of armies as he sent them out into military expeditions. And how that when he would say that you will go and when you encounter non-Muslims, if they are Christians, offer them Islam. If they refuse, offer them zimma, which is acceptance of payment of jizya and submission to Muslim jurisdiction and sovereignty. If they are non-believers, then you fight. If you defeat, then you capture their men into slavery or kill them, and women will be taken as spoils of war. Now, the book I cited to you gives the hadith and the sources like that. So the point, therefore, is not simply just to be apologetic about calling jihad something that is Western conspiracy to defame Islam. It's much more than that. It is our historical reality, and it is very well documented scripturally and so on. So in that respect, when you talk about jihad as an integral to our understanding of Islam, slavery as integral to our understanding of Islam, subordination of women as integral to our understanding of Islam, and still talk about Islam being appropriate to all time and place, I don't think that will stand to reason. Therefore, either we give up on the claim that Islam is appropriate to all time and place, or we find ways of reinterpreting Islamic norms in order to address these aspects in particular. And what I find really unhelpful is the apologetic, selective, highly selective ways in which Muslims engage in these conversations. They will cite verses which seem to support the position that they seek, and they will overlook verses which counter that position. We do this all the time. And of course, we can't lie to Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala. Either you believe Islam, the whole Quran to have been revealed and to be binding on us, or you don't. If you do, then you cannot be selective about which verses to cite. The question about Sharia courts and civil courts. Of course, Malaysia was not always like this. I mean, if you go back to 1957, and the legal system that you inherited from the British colonial administration, Sharia courts were limited to personal law jurisdiction, as in many other Muslim majority countries, but you cannot maintain two parallel legal systems equally sort of authoritative. One has to be subordinate to the other. Simply because you will have these cases of conflict. So, for example, if custody of children, and again here when you have issues that are subject to federal law as opposed to provincial or state law, then still the question is who is superior? Which legal system is superior? That's why the federal is superior constitutionally over state legislation. That's why Kelantan has not been able to implement its hudud statutes. But you cannot maintain them as two parallel systems which are equally valid. One has to be subordinate to the other. And you're right that you cannot have it in a way that Sharia courts will have some rulings and civil courts will have another ruling in conflict. Because then still people, litigants, have to know what to do. Who will have the custody over these children? And so on. I think it's also part of that fundamental ambiguity that we have and reticence about. Of course, Zia al-Haq introduced something similar in Pakistan in the mid-70s and subsequently established Sharia courts, including a Sharia appellate court. But when that appellate court started issuing rulings that contradicted the secular legal system of Pakistan, he started sort of dissolving those courts for appellate courts and started limiting their jurisdiction. So whenever you have that, you have a confusing situation where you have conflicting jurisdictions and you have no means of resolving that conflict. And especially with the moral authority of Sharia, people find it very difficult and threatening to be confronted with a situation where Sharia jurisdiction cannot be maintained. I hope, of course, and all of those points that I tried to make are complex, and there is much more to it than what I was able to say, but let us see what other questions you have.
Assalamualaikum, Prof. and Dr. Mus. Okay, in early of your lectures now, you said our country is facing a serious challenge, right? If let's say Sharia is enacted in this country, it cannot be undone. My question is, why it cannot be undone? Can you elaborate more on that?
So from what we've heard, what we've heard from you, I believe that Muslims here are more liberal to outside ideas. But the majority of Muslims in this country are more prone to conservatives and traditionalist views of Muslims, of Islam. So what would be needed to convey the idea or liberate the Muslim minds over, like, to accept new ideas like what you said, reinterpreting the Sharia and Reformation and so on. So thank you.
Hi, Prof. Just to follow up on his question, so I believe that the crowd here are somewhat more liberal and open-minded compared to the so-called outside world. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there's a local professor at UTM. He actually made a statement regarding your visit when you had the talk at IRF in Kuala Lumpur, and he said things like, to quote him, your visit roughly translated, create confusion among the Muslim community, and he said that by saying that hudud is not in the Quran, you are somewhat misleading and do not really understand the Sharia or hudud. And he even pointed out your background, which he said is quite secular because you study law and so on. And I'm afraid these are and he has a lot of influence, this professor, and I'm afraid this is the typical mentality that we find in the so-called conservative Muslim in Malaysia, and they are not small in numbers. So how do you even begin to engage with these people? Because for one, if you are not an ulama, if you do not study the Middle East, if you do not speak Arabic, it's almost as if any arguments that you bring, they would almost totally neglect it. So how do you even engage with them? Or because I feel it's quite dangerous to just retreat to each other's corner. Seculars, we have this discourse among ourselves today. They have their discourse among themselves today. In Malay, we would just say all the shock and diri only lah. So I'll be interested to see how you would respond to that.
Professor, I think that your answers are, the most honest, candid of all that I have heard. I want to just think of it this way: assuming that, say, I'm not a Muslim, but assuming that I am a Muslim, and how would I respond to your argument? You pointed out point blank that slavery is part of Sharia, right? And so you're putting a very tough question forward and say, are you for slavery or are you for Sharia? In a sense, your answer is to say, now, if you're not for slavery, you need to reinterpret Sharia. But someone, I assume, that may come from a position and say, yeah, but Sharia is really what I really want, because if I don't believe in Sharia, I'm no longer Muslim, right? So how do you find an Islamic argument for them to believe that it's their job to reinterpret Sharia to exclude or delegitimize or to end slavery? Thank you.
Can I start in reverse, linking this last question with the preceding remark? Please ask the professor who said my visit to Malaysia and what I'm saying is confusing Muslims. Ask that professor, is slavery still valid from a Sharia point of view or not? Very specific. Any Muslim who disagrees with anything that I'm saying, just be very specific and blunt. If they say that slavery is no longer part of Sharia, ask him or her for their evidence in support of that claim. Because the Quran and the Hadith and the early history of Muslims and all the Muslim schools, take any book or any manual of any of the schools, Shafi'i, Abu Hanifa, any of them, or any of the subsequent scholars who wrote down their ideas, and look and see, is there not a chapter on slavery? Is there are not sort of cross-cutting references to slavery in all sorts of, you go to Friday prayer, and when, or you Eid prayer, and when the Imam will be speaking about kafara, he will mention i'taqu raqaba, that is liberating a slave, as one of the options. Does that not presuppose slavery to be part of the structure, economic and social system? So the point is really about how really Sharia is not Islam. Sharia is a human interpretation of Islam. And again, I will give you very specific points. The term Sharia, in the way that we use it today, is not to be found in the Quran at all. The Quran does not speak about Sharia as we now understand it, as a comprehensive normative system or legal system that binds us and so on. That وَلَكُلُّ مِنْكُمْ جَعَلْنَا شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا, for example, there are 3 references in the Quran to شَرَعَ يَشْرَعُ شَرِيعَةً, any of the terms that associated with شَرَعَ يَشْرَعُ. And you will find that none of them relate to our understanding of it today. In fact, the term Sharia was totally unknown throughout the first century of Islam, the 2nd century of Islam. And it is only in the 3rd century of Islam that we find the term Sharia for the first time. So if you go to Muslims of the 1st century of Islam and say Sharia, they will not know what you are talking about. If you go to Muslims of the 2nd century and you talk about, and any of this is easy to verify. I mean, it is actually quite accessible. You can verify any of these claims. So if the term Sharia is not known to early Muslims in that sense, how does it come to be equivalent to Islam? Now, you know that Muslims disagree about their understanding of Sharia. They disagree about many principles of Sharia. If that disagreement is about Islam itself, then there is no Islam. So you have to accept that Islam is shared among all Muslims, but their interpretation of Sharia is specific to their tradition, which could be Maliki, Hanbali, Shafi'i, or Shi'i, or and so on. So in other words, that the term Sharia, the concept of Sharia, is only an aspect of our experience of Islam, of our understanding of Islam, our living the values of Islam, which depends on the school to which we subscribe or the point of view which we accept. So in that sense, it is, when I say that there is a problem with a particular aspect of Sharia, I'm saying there is a problem with a particular aspect of human understanding of Islam. And that human understanding has and can change because it's only human, it is not divine. What is divine is the source. The Quran is divine. Any articulation of what we now claim to be a Sharia principles are human, and they cannot be otherwise. How would human beings understand the Quran in order to comply with its mandates and dictates if it is not a question of applying their mind to it? So it is, to my colleague here, that it is not a choice between being Muslim or not, it's a choice between accepting possibilities and requirements of free interpretation of Sharia or not. If we do not, then we have to defend slavery morally, and we have to defend the subordination of women morally, and we have to defend the use of jihad as an aggressive way of implementing and propagating the faith morally, meaning that legally we cannot defend it, by the way. Today it's illegal to engage in jihad as a matter of international law. And that if you do, then you will be threatening international peace and security. And the Security Council can authorize the use of force to stop that practice. So in other words, that it is not open to us as nation states, part of the international system of nation states that we live in and we are part of, to engage in jihad in that sense. And by the way, I mean, really listen, Saudi Arabia and Iran are engaging in a war over Yemen. Correct? So we have two Muslim majority countries fighting each other over a third Muslim country in order to both of them or either of them to impose its political will on that country. And we know at least Saudi Arabia is dependent on the United States to launch its war in Yemen against Iran. And that the United States is in fact perceived to be the primary defender of the Sunni Muslim world against the Shia threat of Iran. So when you have these types of geopolitical realities among Muslims, can we still talk about Sharia and Jihad and these types of understanding of Islam? So I think if we look around and see how we are doing this, we will see. I hope I can get on to the other. So I think I touched on the point about the Imam who was saying that, or the Ustaz, the professor who was saying that I'm confusing Muslims. Let Muslims be the judge. Yes. So I mean, like, I'm a single person who came all the way. I'm from Sudan. I've been all my life a Muslim. I have been called murtad and all sorts of charges before. This is not new to me. In fact, I was in prison in the 80s under similar charges, and I left Sudan in the 80s because of similar charges. So this is not to me, and it's not shocking, and it is not threatening or frightening either. With all due respect, I don't care whether he accepts me as a Muslim or not. That is not the point. The point is, what are the arguments I'm making, and how do you respond to those arguments? I mean, this business about shooting the messenger or discrediting the messenger, the point is respond to what I'm saying instead of trying to say that I'm bad because I'm saying this. If that is so obvious, what is wrong with what I'm saying? Is slavery part of Sharia or not? And so on, and to be specific. So the point actually is to say, trust Muslims to make up their mind about what they hear. The question earlier about freedom of religion, we seem to assume that we can't trust people to make up their own mind, so we have to protect them from this type of discourse, which is really not a democratic or mature way of dealing with issues. That if Muslims cannot make up their minds, if they need to be protected against themselves, then we have a serious problem. About the difficulty of liberating Muslims and so on, again, I think no alternative but to candid discourse. So here I am, I'm saying what I believe to be true. I'm trying to defend it and support it by whatever claims and arguments and sources that I can cite. And you can have someone else counter what I'm saying, whether in the same conversation or some other place, and you make up your mind. You can check anything of what I said, and again, you can make up your mind. I think, by the way, we are not an exception to human history. Muslims are not exceptional in any way. Nobody is exceptional. I mean, all societies have been through this. And there are some societies which are struggling with these issues in relation to their religion, whatever that religion may be. For example, you can think of Catholics and issues of for example, as simple as population control or questions of birth control. There are issues that people struggle with, and they have different opinions, and some people are seen to be heretical from that tradition for those reasons. So this is not new, and in fact it is not exceptional in contemporary world affairs. The question also, every time, it has been a question of how to confront these difficulties within the tradition through civilized, respectful, decent discourse. I put my point of view and try to support it, you put point of view and try to support it, and let people make up their mind. I think that is the only way to liberate and to really come to sort of releasing the energy of Muslim societies so that they can be part of global events regionally and globally, instead of now being sort of at the end of the sort of the human caravan. I mean, we are the lowest of all in the indices. We are following, and our lives, our public discourse, our foreign policy is all a reflection of our weakness, our dependency, our incompetence. We rely on these same Western powers that we accuse of being heretical and secularist and this and that. We rely on them to defend us and defend our territories. Now, what is the position of Malaysia in relation to the United States regarding the Pacific Rim conversations and trade relations and security arrangements and so on? Isn't all of that dominated by the United States? So why are people willing to live with this and at the same time willing to accuse and to condemn the United States for all sorts of things? I think we should be truly independent in our affairs, conducting our own defense, controlling our own economies before we engage in charging everybody else with all sorts of claims about their religious integrity and about their social condition.
Professor, is it healthy for, I mean, like, many arguments are discounted by statements like, you are not well versed enough. So is it healthy for the interpretation of Sharia or Islam to be dominated by traditionalists and Arabic fluent scholars? And also, in your personal opinion, like we were talking about interpretation of Sharia. So we have several alternatives. We have Yasir Auda writing about Maqasid Sharia, and we have Dr. Fauzi here writing about a Sufi alternative. So in your opinion, what would be a really good interpretation as an alternative?
Hello, good evening. Okay, I'd like to ask one question, basically is that, okay, we have the holy book called the Quran, right? Shouldn't be the interpretation of a holy book be actually interpreted not by humans, but according to the holy book? I mean, people used to interpret, but what I'm saying is that shouldn't it be interpreted according to the holy book? Thank you.
Assalamualaikum, Prof. Simple question. Just want to ask your opinion regarding what our country latest issues. What is your opinion if we implement the Sharia law only for the non-Muslim, for the non-believers? Because a few of my non-Muslims said that because actually when the issues they talk about, they want to change the punishment to be more like 6 to 10 or 12 or whatever, and then few of my friends, non-Muslim friends, say that is good because that will make people scared and they don't want to do that. So what is your opinion on that? Thank you.
Okay. On the first point, I think it's not only not healthy to allow the hegemony of traditional scholars or so-called ulama or fuqaha to control our understanding of Islam. I would argue that it is completely the opposite, that they should have nothing to do with that, because we don't really trust them on most of our critical affairs. So the so-called ulama are not educated, are not sort of engaged in public policy affairs, in our economy, our security, our social development, our all sort of affairs we go to secular, educated, civil intellectuals and technically competent sort of actors. So when it comes to a question of religion, we go to this group. And that means that really what our religion is and the value of our religion is quite sort of low in our list of priorities. So we trust this group with the least significant aspects of our lives. And yet we refer to them when it comes to the most fundamental aspect of our Islamic identity, which is to tell us what Islam means to us also. I think that you are right that probably understanding the Quran in the original Arabic, and by the way, Arabic is my native tongue. And this is the first language that I learned, and I read the Quran in the original, and I've been reading it in the original all my life. I'm 70 years old now. And I have lived as a Muslim all this time, according to my own belief and understanding. I'm willing to be accountable for what I'm saying before Rabbi subhanahu wa ta'ala. I know I will die, and I will probably die very soon, and I will be accountable for what I'm saying tonight. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind about this. But the point is that I would not entrust anybody else to tell me what Islam means to me. I would make up my own mind. Part of making up my own mind is to read sources and to read commentaries and to read interpretations that will help me understand what the Quran is saying and why it is saying what it is saying. So overall, I think that there is no alternative to taking over our control of our own religion. There is no alternative but to be willing to stand up and to defend our positions, because this is the life for which we are responsible and accountable. And whether we like it or not, you know, I'm sure that we are all aware of this, in the Day of Judgment, it does not in the least help to say, someone else told me so. You know, when you stand up in the Day of Judgment and you do something and they say, you say because the Mufti said so, or because the ulama said so, you know that does not stand. And that will never be a defense to any charge that you face about our conduct. So since we know that, why is it that we are willing to entrust this class of people to tell us what Islam means and to act according to their mandates and dictates, when we know that we not really stand as a way to defend ourselves? So I agree that, in fact, responding and challenging the hegemony of the ulama is critical and, in fact, imperative for us if we want to get a significant understanding of our meaning, our religion, by a way in which that we can defend and morally implement and so on. I think the other question I may not have touched on is tafsir al-Quran bi-nass al-Quran. There was a point that was made I said it in Arabic. That interpreting the Quran by the text of the Quran. But actually, that can never be done, because to do it, you have to understand, which is already a human act. So you see, for example, when something comes as an issue, where do you start? By making up your mind as to which verses are relevant to this. That choice is a human choice. Let me say this in a different way, maybe. For example, the question about there was a question earlier about custody of children, or the question that men, husbands or fathers are presumed to be the guardians of children or their lives, regardless of their competence and regardless of the higher competence of their wives. So a professionally, a PhD in psychology, a professional professor in the university, public figure, all of that. But she cannot have custody over her own children. Her illiterate, incompetent, even drunk and sort of addicted husband will automatically, legally have custody over the children or their lives. He will have the right to define, to determine all moral aspects about the child education, upbringing, which schools he goes to. He will be the guardian of the child financially, and all of this. This does not make sense. It is not really something that I can defend morally. But I want to challenge this. Where would I start? By trying to find verses in the Quran or Hadith which will enable me to make an argument. Isn't that usually the case? Whatever it is, don't take that position that I'm advancing. Take a more traditional position. Anything that we want to talk about. For example, Ramadan is coming up in a week or so. And I want to decide, do I have a license not to fast or not? Because I'm ill, because I'm old, because I'm traveling. So I will be looking to verses in the Quran that tell me when do I have the license not to fast. And then I will be, so that choice, which verses I look at, is a human choice. And then how I understand those verses is a human interpretation of those verses. So when you say that, can we interpret the Quran by the Quran? For example, there are Muslim scholars in the past who have said that. Al-Zahiri, for example, would have argued that we should never, and the whole tradition that sort of railed against Abu Hanifa, for example, against Ahlul Rai, the claim that Al-Asha'ira, they will say that we have to be strictly, literally textualist, textualist, not contextualist. And they will say that we should never exercise any human judgment. But in saying that, they have already exercised a human judgment. To make that argument, already you have used human intellect. So it is not possible not to do it. And therefore, interpreting the Quran with the Quran presupposes a human judgment as which part of the Quran are you talking about, and which other part can be used to interpret the part that you need to interpret. Am I coming across, or is it am I not clear in this? So I'm saying that there is no possibility of avoiding using human reason and human experience. And in fact, there is no value in avoiding human reason and human experience. Because it's all about our being accountable for how we live our lives. So to be accountable, I have to comprehend, and I have to understand, and I have to accept. How can I be responsible for something that I do not accept? I hope that came across somewhat.
I think we have come to a close, given the time constraint. I'd like to thank you all for the interaction, and please join me to thank the Professor.
So let's give a round of applause to Dr. Musa and Professor. We are like 40 minutes past time, so thank you all very much for staying until the very end, and have a good evening. Thank you.